This talk is about maybe one of the most fundamental of physical considerations, and that is, how does the landscape, the site, the land, the actual dirt that a building is built on, begin to tell us something about what kind of building should be there? And sites can be extremely generative of architecture, and we want to investigate a little bit today how buildings relate very strongly to the land that they come out of. The first couple of examples we're going to be looking at of buildings relating to the land are older examples. And I want to start with an example that's in the US, but is ancient. And I think sometimes we have this weird idea that we don't have any ancient culture in the United States. We're a new culture. But in fact, certainly if you look at North America, the Zapotec Indians did very sophisticated work at Monte Alban in Mexico, centuries before Christ. So we do have ancient civilizations in the Americas. But the example I want us to look at today is really one in the United States, one in New Mexico. And that is Acoma Sky City, which was developed from the 12th to the 17th century. So it's still, quite an ancient building and settlement of the Native Americans in New Mexico. But the thing we're primarily interested in is how these Native Americans use the land as an inspiration for their architecture. So this is Acoma Sky City, which sits on top of a mesa in northern New Mexico. And you can easily see in the landscape of northern New Mexico where it's dead flat, and then out of that come these big, bold, flat-topped mesas like that. And then the Native Americans, when they're building, are building again kind of big, bold, flat-topped forms that are very much like the landscape. Now, in this case, they're choosing a site which is fortified naturally. They don't need to build a wall around their city because they've got a spot in the landscape that's very difficult to attack from the outside. There are a few little trails that will take you up to that upper plateau, but it's letting the land actually do a lot of the work right there. The fortification is already being done by the landscape. And then within that, they're building buildings that they've really generated from physical considerations. They maybe in prior generations lived in some caves in these mesas, and they realized the thermal stability in those caves. When it's super hot outside, it's cooler inside the cave. When it's very cold outside, it's warmer inside the cave. So they made these very thick-walled structures that are made out of masonry, just like that cave was made out of stone. In this case, it's mud-dried brick, so that they would just dry the brick in the sun, and they would make really thick, massive walls, so that would make it very cool on the inside, like being in a cave when it was a hot day, as it often is in New Mexico. And then at night, they actually would sleep on the roof, so that they had stairs, ladders that took them up to sleeping areas up there where they could catch every breeze that would come through, and that would be a much more temperate place to be at night. So they're learning from how they inhabited the land in a very rudimentary way, and they're making buildings that have analogies to that inhabitation of the land that they were accustomed to. And the sum of that is all of these buildings in the village that are made of these thick masonry walls with roof terraces on the top of them. And they emulate in some ways the kind of mesas that exist around. The primary building is the Church of San Esteban del Rey. That's one of the later buildings in the city. And again, it's got a little bit of European church influence, maybe in the kind of Baroque bell towers, but mostly it really is a landform. It's like a kind of mesa that is used there. And then with great timber spanning between those thick masonry walls, but grown very much out of the land. And I want to make the point that's 12th century when that was being done, which is a really, really ancient kind of building in America. Now, at exactly the same time in Europe, this building is also growing out of the land. And in this case, there was a very unusual landform off the west coast of France. This was a very, very flat landscape all the way around. It's right on the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see how completely flat everything is around. And then miraculously, there's this huge boulder that just rises out of the ground. And way back in the 12th century, there were religious people who looked at that and said, that's an act of God. This is a remarkable kind of spiritual moment where this rock comes out of this flat landscape. So way back in the 12th century, they began to build religious buildings on the top of that rock. Then they had a kind of monastery that went up there, and then a nunnery went up there. And there began to be this ensemble of religious buildings that inhabited the top of this rock called Mont Saint-Michel. And the architecture of this is really, you can't think of it in any way except as a part of its site. It's taking that vertical upthrust of that rock and it's just extending it in vertical upthrust of the additional buildings that are put on the rock. And the whole experience of this little now village of Mont Saint-Michel is it's constantly kind of climbing and ascending and getting to the top up there. Flights of stairs everywhere and always a kind of vertical expression of every building. And then when you get to the top, oh my God, the most amazing views of everything all around and this kind of godlike feeling or certainly spiritual feeling of being up above everything else. And that's what's generating the architecture here, is that site, the characteristics of that site, taking advantage of that site, and then using it to inspire, even in detail, how the masonry is laid up, like great cliffs with these buttresses that are reinforcing that vertical thrust of the building up into the sky. This is one of the most just striking, awesome places ever. I had a student who did their project on Mont Saint-Michel several years ago, and her family was going to Paris. Well, it's a long way from Paris to Mont Saint-Michel. Mont Saint-Michel is in the middle of freaking nowhere. And she convinced her parents they had to make this pilgrimage all the way out to Mont Saint-Michel when there's all this gorgeous Parisian goodies that are sitting there in town. But she says she dragged them out there, and just one look like that, and they're like, oh my God, that's amazing. And then when you actually experience it, it's one of the most beautiful spots on earth, a really extraordinary piece of architecture. And it's really coming out of the land. It's inspired by physical considerations, how the building sits on the land. Now, for the rest of the talk today, I want to briefly hit on three different buildings that are just completely inspired by the land. The first of these is a house by Frank Lloyd Wright. This is called Falling Water. It was done in 1936. It is probably Frank Lloyd Wright's most famous work. There was, I don't know, at the bicentennial or something, there was a big poll of architects, what's the most amazing building in all of the United States? And it was Falling Water. It's certainly considered to be an iconic and amazing architectural work in the US. This was commissioned by a guy named Edgar Kaufman, who was a businessman in Pittsburgh. He owned the most elegant department store in Pittsburgh. It was the department store for all the wealthy steel barons in the era. And he had a beautiful house. Edgar Kaufman had a beautiful house in Pittsburgh. But he owned this piece of land just outside of town. And he would take his family out there on the weekends and they would picnic and enjoy nature and being in nature. This beautiful site with a little creek that ran through it like that. And then finally the Kaufmans said, you know, we want a more permanent place. We don't want to just have to camp when we go out there. We'd like a house out there. And given the fact that he was this amazing tastemaker and you know, erudite fellow, he said, I'm going to get the best architect in the country, which at that time was definitely Frank Lloyd Wright. So Frank Lloyd Wright is in his 60s. He's a very famous, very mature architect. He's doing this project for this very wealthy, successful businessman. He goes out to the site and he explores the site, looks around, and he immediately understood that the building would be very much inspired by the site. Now this little drawing was done. There are several things about this woods I should explain. One is this was a sedimentary soil area. It has sedimentary stone. So that lays up in layers. And over time there have been uplifts of those stones. So what you get here is a flat area like that, and then a bump down, and then another flat area and a bump down. And that's just kind of characteristic of the way the ground is shaped here. Flat, bump up, flat, bump up. And then there are these creeks that go through that create little waterfalls at each of those moments. But you see that those lines in the land all the way through here. And then in contrast to that are these very vertical trees, very tall, skinny trees in that woods. And when the Kaufmans would come out, there was a little ledge right there that overlooked the creek. And the creek was flat through here, and then there was a little waterfall and a flat area, and another little waterfall and a flat area. And there was a very beautiful spot right there they'd like to hang out. And the Kaufmans thought, okay, well, we'll put the building up on the top of the hill here, and we'll be able to go down there when we want to and enjoy our favorite spot. And Frank Lloyd Wright had a very different idea. He said, no, we should put the house right here so that you're really engaged with that beautiful spot all the time. And they said, oh, we don't want to obliterate that spot. No. The house is going to be very sympathetic to that moment and really just kind of extend the qualities that are already there. So he did not want to put the house at the top of the hill. He wanted to nestle it into this intimate area that was so enjoyable there. So this is what's called a topographical drawing. So the lines here are as if you cut a plane every 1 foot through the landscape. This means it's steeper through there. It's shallower and flatter up here. And that really was the site of the house right there. So Frank Lloyd Wright had understood the site completely there. He then goes back to his home in Spring Green, Wisconsin, and for a while didn't seem to be doing much on this. And then Edgar Kaufman got a little impatient, and so he happened to be in Chicago, and he calls up Frank Lloyd Wright, and he said, Frank, I'm in Chicago, it's not very far from Spring Green. How about if I take the train out tomorrow morning and see what progress you're making on the house? And Frank, sure, absolutely. Come on out, Edgar. You'll arrive about 11. We'll have lunch, and then we'll look in the afternoon at the progress on the house. Well, everybody else in the office is like, duh, dude, we haven't done anything on that house. There's not a single scrap of paper on that house. You did the research, but nothing's happened. But this is very telling. Frank Lloyd Wright then sat down that afternoon, and he just did a few sketches of what the house would be, a little plan, a little section, and then he gave them to his assistants and had them draw them up a little more precisely. They worked on them that next morning. Edgar Kaufman came in, they had their lunch, and Frank Lloyd Wright showed him the drawings, and he was like totally impressed. That's perfect, wonderful, and that pretty much is the house that's there today. Now, there would be some people who would say, oh, wow, that's genius, Frank Lloyd Wright. Just give him a napkin, he sits down and sketches, and this fantastic house comes out of it. But I want to make it clear, he had been designing that house in his head for months, but he had been experiencing it. And really, when you're working with the land, it's very much an experiential thing. And so he had been imagining how it would be to be there in every aspect. And then it was not hard. He's a mature architect. He then can draw out what's in his head, and that's what he showed to Edgar Kaufman. But was it a moment of inspiration? No, it was a long period of gestation and developing that idea of the house in his head. So this is the site. As you come up along a road through the woods, you begin to see the horizontal ledges of the landscape through here, and you see the horizontal ledges of the house, really reflecting that, the stone in the landscape, the concrete in the house, but very, very gentle set in there. It's cantilevered out from the slope of the house there over Bear Run, the little creek through here, so that all of that kind of becomes one ensemble. The horizontal lines of the landscape and the vertical lines of the trees are expressed in the stonework and the ledges of the terraces as they extend out from the house. There you can see a section where it's rooted into the ground and then cantilevered over the creek and all of that, and then terraces that lead you down to engage in that creek, but all of that becoming a kind of single ensemble of nature and man-made land adding together to make the house. Now, I want us to look at the plan of that house right there. And if you can remember a number of talks ago, we were talking about the Villa Rotunda by Palladio. It's that perfect square with a circle inside the square and all of the rooms perfectly proportioned. That plan is beautiful. That plan is a piece of composition and a really lovely ensemble of spaces and forms, but in a very abstract way. This is actually not a beautiful plan, but it is reflecting all of the characteristics of the landscape. It's dodging a tree there, it's extending a boulder here, it's really becoming like the landscape. And that's what we're interested in here, is how a building can come right out of those natural characteristics of the site. So on the site, you approach it like this. You actually go between two existing boulders, and the front door is right there, so you would drive your car through there. There's a bridge that goes on up to the upper part of the house there. On the other side, as the hill descends, you can see one of those ledges with a waterfall, a second ledge with a waterfall, and it's like Wright makes a third ledge and a fourth ledge. And now all four of those seem to work together as if they were really one landform in the woods. There probably is more square feet outside on the terraces than inside, so you're really living and experiencing the woods and the landscape. This is a picture I took of the stone in the area where it's that sedimentary stone, kind of a rough gray stone. Frank Lloyd Wright laid it up in falling water in sedimentary kinds of layers and in that kind of rough texture. And it's exactly the same gray stone that exists all over on the site there, so that the building becomes really one with the landscape. Even things like the light quality. In the woods, the dappled light comes through the leaves. All around the house, he puts trellises and then grows vines on the trellises, so that again, as the light penetrates the house, it's always that natural dappled light. Falling water has this amazing chameleon quality to it. So when it's summertime, I don't know, it just looks perfect. The color of the stone and the color of the terraces are all the same, and it just feels so natural and right there. Then as it gets to be autumn time and the leaves turn, I don't know, there's a little ochre color in that concrete work that now makes it feel just perfect in the autumn time. And then in the dead of winter, when everything's white, again, it feels like a kind of frozen iceberg up there. It's so much a part of the land and the site and the place. It just extends it perfectly. And when you're in the building, you feel that. He made these incredibly kinky windows that actually open at the corner. So the corner is usually the most solid part of a building, but here he makes L-shaped windows that open up so your eye just goes right inside to outside. He makes no mullion at the corner here, just butts the glass together. So even when you're on the terrace, of course, you're in the woods, but even when you're in the rooms, you feel like you're in the woods. There's this kind of sleight of hand of where the glass actually goes into the stone, and you see just as little mullion and edge as possible, and just feel the indoors and the outdoors connecting completely. That big rock where the Kaufmans like to sun overlooking the waterfall, he actually made that rock into the hearth of the house. So that becomes an integral part of the fireplace and turns into the floor. And it's like you're on that real rock of the site when you're at the fireplace there. And the colors and textures and everything of the interior, it's very simpatico with that landscape on the outside. Now, this is, as I said, one of the most famous houses in the world by one of the most famous architects ever. But it has everything to do with just being about that site, that land, that place, that stone, that water, those landforms that are generating the shape and character of the architecture. A second building I want us to look at is in a completely different landscape. This is out on the coast of California, just north of San Francisco. The architects here are Moreland and Turnbull Whitaker, a partnership of guys that worked on this in the 1960s. And this is, we'll talk a little bit later about the whole land development, but this condominium building sits on a beautiful site right on the Pacific Ocean and overlooking gorgeous landscape up and down the coast there. There had been a few old barns and things like that around there, but it was, at the time they built this, pretty much a virgin landscape. Now there actually was a history of that landscape we'll talk about later, but what we want to focus on here is this idea of a building that just really comes out of the ground. There's that coastline and the color of the rocks, and then the slope as it goes up, and all of that is really just creating the slope of the roof. Even the kind of articulation of the wall is kind of like the articulation of the rock. Charles Moore, one of those architects, was fond of calling it just a big wooden rock. It's very, very windy here, so they cluster the condominiums around a little courtyard, and that courtyard is protected from the wind, so you get the beautiful views without getting knocked on your ass by the wind. It's made of these very heavy timbers. There's tons of redwood around there, so they're using the native redwood in the forest, just like they did in the old barn in the area, as heavy timber pieces. And then they're making siding out of the same native material that is very, very common around there, because that's what they have to build with, the wood that's there. It's very articulated frame there is exposed on the inside, and the interior even has a feeling of the site. You know, some people buy condominiums in these beautiful locations like Colorado or, you know, the coast of California, and the condominium looks like a damn apartment in West Campus. It's just like a generic condo. It's really wonderful here where there's big space and these incredible views out, that when you're inside the unit, you also have that sense of big space and openness. And the ruggedness of that coastline, you still feel that in the ruggedness of the materials. So the whole building, inside and outside, is reflecting the land and the place and the views and the character of that incredible environment. So here, instead of cutting it up into lots of little bedrooms, there are little sleeping lofts and very inventive ways of using the space, and then with big windows that have these panoramic views out to the Pacific Ocean. And the texture and the color and the material have everything to do with that site, that region, the character of that place and that land as it makes the architecture. So Sea Ranch is one kind of landscape and a kind of architecture that just grows out of it, almost like a natural accretion on those rocks. So the third of these buildings I want us to look at is, again, a totally different landscape. We looked at western Pennsylvania and those woods and the creeks there. We looked at the coast of California, very beautiful, memorable landscape there. The third one is the desert in Arizona. And again, this is by Frank Lloyd Wright. This actually was done from about 1937 to 1959. So when he began to work on Taliesin, it was at the same time he was doing the building, the house at Falling Water. He continued, this was his own house, he continued to do additions and pieces of that all the way up to 1957. He died in 1959, so he lived there right up till the time he died, and he continued to diddle with it. But again, it came out of the land. Frank Lloyd Wright had been living in Wisconsin, and his health was suffering somewhat. And his doctor told him, you need to not spend your winters in Wisconsin. It's cold up here. Find a way to get to a warmer climate for the winters. So he would move to Arizona in the winter time. And at first they just pitched tents. They bought a little piece of land and they pitched tents. And they stayed in Arizona in the winter time. And then eventually they started to build Taliesin West, his home in Arizona. It's very sprawling desert landscape, occasionally little hills that come out. There are very beautiful, richly colored stones that are in that area. And essentially, the tradition of building in that area was either to do dugouts, because you have very, very hot days and very cold nights often. So if you got the thermal stability of being below the ground, it would make it cooler during the day and warmer at night. So he could see that the Native Americans had done dugouts there. And so in many cases, he kind of dug the buildings into the landscape. They're very low, but they sort of reach into the ground there. And that was a thermal device, but it also made the building almost like a landform. And in many cases, you can kind of see it as if it were just growing out of the land and not so much looking like an object placed on the land. And then the other thing that he could see people who had inhabited this area using is tents. And they used the tents themselves, these lightweight structures that give lots of shade but allow the breeze to go through. And so he really made the complex a combination of those dugouts and these kind of tents, which originally were made in canvas, were later converted to fiberglass, but in a way a kind of tent in the studios and some of the parts of the building. So he's not only learning from the flatness of the landscape, using the stone that was there in the landscape and using it in an interesting way that makes it almost like concrete, very thick mortar joints, or concrete with very big aggregate, but something they could really show the ruggedness of that stone in the desert. And then on top of that, these kind of tent forms. And so they're learning not just from the land, but the way that Native Americans had inhabited that land over a period of time. There you can see that great, those beautiful walls with the rich local stones worked into them. So you can see in the plan here how it's just sprawling out, that big flat land, digging into it, making tents above it, but just sprawling through the desert there. And then occasionally creating a little oasis, like you find in the desert when you get just a little water. Things get cooler and softer, but the buildings nestled in and very much growing out of the land. And the spaces themselves cool, kind of protected from the hot sun, and kind of dugouts at some times, and then other times bright and feeling like tents. So I want to wrap up here by just making a point about two of these buildings. So we looked at Falling Water, which Frank Lloyd Wright was doing in the 1930s, Taliesin West, which he began in the 1930s. So these are buildings being done by the same architect at the same time. Now there's a kind of what I think is a crazy notion that some people have, that what being a great architect is about is, I don't know, establishing your own style. So yeah, Frank Lloyd Wright, he made the Frank Lloyd Wright style. And basically, if you really know his career and his work, that's baloney. There isn't any Frank Lloyd Wright style. Here you have him in the same period of time doing two buildings that are radically different. I'm sure I could convince someone who didn't know these buildings that they were not done by the same architects. They're completely different from each other. And yet, what they hold in common is this respect for the land. Now, that's what Frank Lloyd Wright was about, not some generic style that he plops down everywhere, but that investigation of what is this site, what is this land, what's appropriate for this ecology, what's appropriate for this climate. It was those physical considerations of the site that really generated the architectural form and made him such a creative architect that every time out he's inventing something new because he's responding to those characteristics in the land. And Taliesin West and Falling Water are classic examples of that. Okay, see you later.